Stopping in to visit with us, but just in order to stay on time, we're going to go ahead and get the program started this afternoon. So I've done something that's a little uncharacteristic. I actually wrote down notes for my introduction, because some of you know that once I get started, it'll be 3:30 and we won't have had the opportunity to hear from our guests. So it's my pleasure to welcome John Daniel to Penn State as our third Coyle Fisher speaker. Sir John Daniel is what we would refer to as a deep thinker in all of the topics regarding open learning, distance education, and how technology is impacting learning. John has championed the cause of open access and education in many organizations throughout the world, some of which I know you're going to hear about this afternoon. John's education is via the universities of Oxford and Paris in metallurgy, and I mention this because of a connection to my father, who worked in Pittsburgh steel mills as a metallurgist clerk. So he would know something of your field, I think. John has held many leadership roles, including appointments with several Canadian universities, UNESCO, and until recently with the Commonwealth of Learning, where he served as president from 2004 until 2012. John has also served as the president of several distance learning organizations, and currently he is the education master with the Beijing Diteo Masters Academy in China. I'm sure he'll correct the pronunciation of that. I probably butchered it. A citizen of both Canada and the UK, he was knighted by Queen Elizabeth for his services to higher education in 1994. His hobbies include, you didn't know I was going to add this, collecting honorary doctorates. He now holds 31 from universities in 17 different countries. Today, John shares with us his perspective of changes in higher education and, in particular, the potential impact of disruptions such as MOOCs and OER. So please join me in welcoming Sir John Daniel to Penn State.
Thank you very much, Larry. It's a great pleasure to be back at Penn State. My last visit goes back to 1997 and a memorable World Conference of the International Council for Distance Education. And indeed, because of diary conflicts, the only ICDE conference I've been able to attend since then was in Hong Kong in 2004, days after I'd learned of my appointment as president of the Commonwealth of Learning and was preparing to leave UNESCO. And your ICD conference here was held 1 year before you created the Penn State World Campus, and I suspect there may have been a link between these two events, both of which have helped to establish this university's global prominence in distance learning. And in that context, I hope it will not be invidious if I single out two of your colleagues for special mention, Gary Miller, who I'm delighted to see is here with us today, and Michael Moore, have added luster to Penn State University and contributed much to the development of distance education as scholars and practitioners, and it's an honor to pay tribute to them as I begin this lecture. Their work over many decades is a reminder, which I'm sure is not needed here, that distance learning in higher education did not begin with the subject of my lecture today, MOOCs, or massive open online courses. Nevertheless, we should be grateful that the frenzy about MOOCs has seared distance learning into the consciousness of the US news media as nothing had done before. You could also say that the emergence of MOOCs has thrown a very large rock into the already turbulent world of higher education, causing waves that seem to be rocking plenty of boats. Here at Penn State, you are now players in the MOOCs game, so you will be beginning to experience some of the waves, or at least the ripples, that it creates. So my title today is simply, Where are MOOCs Taking Higher Education? Let me start with a few words about my own background and biases, because where you stand on an issue depends on where you sit. I mentioned that MOOCs have brought distance learning into American public discourse in a way that nothing has done before, and the only comparable phenomenon which occurred in Europe over 4 decades ago, was the creation of the Open University in the UK, and that was where my own initiation into distance learning began. My full-time higher education, as Larry said, had taken place in medieval universities, with bachelor's and master's degrees from Oxford in metallurgy and a doctorate from the University of Paris in nuclear metallurgy. And I have to confess that during my short career as a metallurgist, I was partly responsible for debasing your currency. Back in 1965, US dimes and quarters were made of silver and had become more valuable as silver than as coins, which is always a bad thing for any currency. And I worked as a very junior member on a project to develop the 3-layer sandwich coins that you now have. My job was to develop a method of quality control so that when you tossed a quarter in the air, it came down in 1 piece, not 3. And there's a link with Penn State because engineering professor Don Koss was a postdoctoral fellow at Oxford at the time and helped me get this interesting summer job before starting my doctoral research in Paris. And Don is also here this afternoon, which pleases me immensely. I would also note that in those days you just had to walk into the US Embassy in London and come out with a green card, how different things are nowadays. And then by a nice coincidence, I received my doctorate just weeks before the ceremony on 23rd of July 1969, at which the Open University received its royal charter. And by another nice coincidence, that event took place just 3 days after Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon, saying, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." A new era in our cosmic awareness had dawned, and a new era in higher education began too, heralded by Chancellor Geoffrey Crowther's statement, which defines the Open University's mission to this day, that the new university would be open as to people, open as to places, open as to methods, and open as to ideas. I watched the moon landing in Minnesota with my wife's relatives, but I was not aware of the creation of the Open University at the time. I'd just taken up my first academic job as assistant professor of metallurgical engineering at the Université de Montréal's École Polytechnique. And within a year, I decided that now that I was an academic, I ought to learn something about education to make me a better teacher. It was only later that I realized this was a deviant thought for a young engineering professor. But by then, I'd enrolled in a part-time master's degree in educational technology at what was then Sir George Williams University, later to become Concordia University. This program required an internship, and in 1971, when I wondered where to do it, the higher education press was suddenly full of stories, rather as is today with MOOCs, about an amazing British innovation, the Open University. I've always believed in going to the source when something interests me, so I arranged to become an unpaid intern at the Open University for the summer of 1972, which proved to be a life-changing experience, and I returned to Canada no longer at ease in the old dispensation, in the words of T.S. Eliot. So shortly afterwards, I joined the distance learning revolution by going to work for the New Tele-Université, which was Quebec's Open University in Quebec City. So having started a biographical digression, I should put all my cards on the table and complete the confession that it took me 25 years to complete the master's degree that I began back in 1970. And by the time I completed the thesis for the program, I had become Vice-Chancellor of the Open University. This thesis became my book, Mega Universities and Knowledge Media Technology Strategies for Higher Education, and gave me a new lease of life as a scholar after my first 12 years as a university president. My next move as a global nomad took me to UNESCO, where my task was to coordinate the global campaign for education for all. And this gave me the inspiration and the material when I got to my next job at the Commonwealth of Learning to produce a book on distance learning at the school level called Mega Schools, Technology and Teachers, Achieving Education for All. And finally, after I left Col last year, the Korea National Open University kindly took me on for a month as a visiting fellow last September. They wanted a research paper, so I plunged into MOOCs and was very lucky with the timing of my paper, Making Sense of MOOCs, Musings in a Maze of Myth, Paradox and Possibility, which made the rounds of the internet very quickly. So, with this background, as a 40-year veteran of distance learning, I bring three beliefs to the discussion of MOOCs. First, big is good. My collection of publications about mega universities, mega schools and mega courses means that I like enrollment figures with a lot of zeros behind them, whether in open universities, open schools or open online courses. And I've devoted my career in both universities and international organizations to opening up education at all levels. But second, I believe in access to success. Ordinary people want their educational achievements to be recognized by society. And open universities and open schools provide that recognition to successful students. Most MOOCs do not offer such recognition, which to me is their fatal flaw, or at least it presents those offering MOOCs with the challenge of being totally honest in their marketing so that hopeful learners in faraway countries are not led up the garden path. And third, I believe that using technology is the only way to enable wide access to successful learning at reasonable cost. Now, you'll be pleased to know I won't explain my metaphor of the iron triangle in any detail today, but it starts from the fact that the challenge in expanding education is always to strike a balance between access, quality and cost, and the triangle represents these as three vectors. The aim is to stretch the iron triangle of access, quality and cost to look like this: higher quality, wider access and lower cost, all at the same time. And only by technology can you do this, because in a classroom situation, any attempt to move one vector in the desired direction tends to make the others worse. This was put another way by your own Professor Darrell Veligol, Professor of Chemical Engineering here, who said, sometimes the constraints of a traditional classroom structure limit what we can accomplish and how many students we can educate. MOOCs bring in a whole new group of students that have as much ability to recreate this world as anyone. So the key point here is that technology has already reconfigured the iron triangle in most areas of our life, both products and services. And you might say that MOOCs represent a dramatic application of the same principle to higher education. But as a 40-year veteran of educational technology, I have seen fads come and seen fads go. MOOCs are a fad that has come. It may not soon go, but will certainly evolve in different manifestations. So before I plunge into the detail of MOOCs, I shall stand back and look a bit at patterns of technology adoption in society generally to give us some perspectives. I shall then try and update you on where the MOOCs boom has reached. And ironically, this is not as easy as it sounds, because although MOOCs are massive and public, institutions can be a bit closed-mouthed about their experience of offering them or their future plans, especially their economic experience and aspirations. And I look forward to hearing your experience from the 5 MOOCs you're now offering, unless you've all signed non-disclosure agreements. I'm then going to revisit briefly the myths, paradoxes and possibilities that I pointed up in my earlier paper and present a revised view of where MOOCs are taking higher education and ask, is this the direction in which higher education should be going? So I start with technology adoption cycles. When I wrote Mega Universities, I drew on Moore's technology adoption life cycle. And its key feature is the chasm that can occur between the early adopters of an innovation and take-up by the early majority. For some innovations, things seem to start well, exponential growth begins, and then suddenly it stalls and falls into the chasm. Today, the talk is more about the Gartner technology hype cycle, which MOOCs illustrate rather nicely. Right now, as more and more universities around the world pile into MOOCs, we must be nearing the peak of inflated expectations. And I say that because despite the bluster from venture capitalists, there is no real business model for MOOCs and little sign of revenue flows for the universities taking part. They may well be investing inflated expectations in the reputational benefits of offering MOOCs. My fellow Vancouverite, Professor Tony Bates, who's a perceptive observer of the online scene, thinks that MOOCs will head into the trough of disillusionment before the end of the year. But to quote him, I doubt they will hit bottom until 2014, when evaluation reports start to roll in and the universities participating decide whether the business model works for them. But I think, he continues, there is enough momentum to carry them through 2013. It's good to juxtapose the technology adoption life cycle and the technology hype cycles and to ask whether the coming chasm will create whether the trough of disillusionment will create a chasm of reduced MOOCs activity. Some institutions may decide that the reputational advantage they hoped for is not worth the cost, or even that there is reputational damage. And some potential newcomers to the flock may conclude that the game is not worth the candle. But what happens then? Online learning is an important part of the future of higher education. Both an early and a late majority of institutions must eventually get online, partly to get costs down, partly to benefit from the academic advantages of the knowledge media, and partly to attract students who are moving in this direction very steadily. But how will universities climb the slope of enlightenment by adopting online learning to reach the plateau of productivity that beckons in the hype cycle? For most institutions, I believe that the plateau of productivity will mean a hybrid model that combines significant online learning with opportunities for face-to-face teaching and support. This is a large step from where most institutions are now, although those already offering some courses and programs through open and distance learning should find it easier to take that step, not least because some of their students will already be mixing and matching learning in both modes. And that must surely apply to Penn State with the background of your world campus. So an important question for us today is whether offering MOOCs will actually help institutions climb the slope of enlightenment towards this plateau of sustainable productivity and a hybrid teaching model. And it's not entirely obvious that it will. Indeed, some cynics argue that elite universities are offering MOOCs to give an impression of modernity while actually protecting the rest of the faculty from the hassle of having to go online. Now, that may be an extreme view, but might the little videos that are the commonest feature of MOOC pedagogy really be doing more to nurture the megalomania of the academics involved than to move the institution towards hybrid teaching and learning for its regular award-bearing programs. Perish the thought. So let me now turn to the MOOCs boom and try to summarise where the MOOCs movement has come from and is now going. This is a fast-changing scene, so whatever I say will be out of date, but let me try anyway. A little history never comes amiss, so let me start with the prehistory of MOOCs, and that means going back 5 years. The term MOOC originated in Canada. Cormier and Alexander invented the acronym in 2008 to describe an open online course at the University of Manitoba designed by George Siemens and Stephen Downes. And this course, Connectivism and Connective Knowledge, was presented to 25 fee-paying students on campus and 2,300 other students from the general public who took the online course free of charge. And the title of the course gives you its flavour. It was inspired by Ivan Illich's philosophy in his book De-Schooling Society, that an education system should, quote, provide all who want to learn with access to available resources at any time in their lives, empower all who want to share what they know, to find those who want to learn it from them, and finally, to furnish all who want to present an issue to the public with the opportunity to make their challenge known. And in this spirit, in this first MOOC, all the course content was available through RSS feeds, and learners could participate with their choice of tools, threaded discussions in Moodle, blog posts, Second Life, and synchronous online meetings. You can see that these courses were a logical development of the open educational resources movement that had been gathering momentum for some 10 years by then. So those early MOOCs, which are called CMOOCs or connecting MOOCs, are very different from the next phase of MOOCs, which caused the media frenzy last year, which are called in the jargon X-MOOCs after edX, the MIT, Harvard, and UC Berkeley consortium that began offering them. Now, those first X-MOOCs had nothing to do with Illich's liberal education philosophy. One writer said that X-MOOCs were at the intersection of Wall Street and Silicon Valley, and indeed had little connection to the spirit of the pioneering CMOOC courses. But some of the creators of the CMOOCs forecast last year that with time, the X-MOOCs movement would return to some of their methods and philosophy. And indeed, late last year, MIT began timidly to connect its students in this way. But here at Penn State, you have an example of how this is now happening more widely. I quote Professor Anna Davinsky, who is leading the course Introduction to Art, Concepts and Techniques, to which many thousands of students have signed up. And she says, quote, unlike a traditional class setting, MOOC students will have to be self-directed and learn to rely on each other for feedback instead of continual guidance from an instructor. The students will have the opportunity to share their creative process and receive suggestions from others enrolled. The ongoing discussion will demonstrate all the unique and diverse perspectives of the people enrolled. You see the connection with those CMOOCs. And Professor Davinsky added, I am a big proponent of free and open education, even though I won't be able to personally appraise each student's work as I might in a typical class. I am thrilled so many students can be exposed to art and share their creative energy on a global level. In my earlier commentaries on MOOCs, I've suggested that the real revolution of MOOCs is that universities with scarcity at the heart of their business model are suddenly embracing openness. And I wonder how many faculty members at these highly selective institutions have discovered, after an experience with a MOOC, that like Professor Divinsky, they really believe in open and free education. Her course shows the diversity that is emerging in MOOCs, and this will create tensions between the tendency of IT platforms to want to standardize things and the tendency of teachers to want to break out of such molds. In my musings in the Mays paper, I noted the experience of the University of Edinburgh, one of Coursera's first foreign partners. One of their courses had many CMOOC features, and they described the Coursera platform as, quote, conservative in terms of online pedagogical practice. Like Professor Divinsky, they wanted learners to exchange their own videos, but found that some of them found comfort in the little didactic videos that are a standard feature of Coursera offerings. And I wonder if Penn State is finding the same thing. Now, you will be more aware than I of the situation in the United States. But when I last heard figures at a conference in the UK last month, Coursera was working with 42 US universities, had reached 3.2 million learners, and was enrolling them at a rate of 1.4 million per month. But before we get carried away by such numbers, let's remember that that is slightly fewer than the enrolment of a single institution in India, the Indira Gandhi National Open University, and many fewer than those in the China Radio and TV university system. But I'm not here to belittle the achievement of MOOCs, simply to give a little perspective. So instead of talking about MOOCs in the US, let me note some developments overseas. And these illustrate the diversity that is developing. Indeed, some wag has remarked that the meaning of every letter in the acronym MOOC is now negotiable. So I'm going to mention 3 MOOC initiatives outside North America in decreasing order of how much I know about them, which is also related to how new they are. It's an interesting irony that, as I noted before, while offering MOOCs is all about openness, those organising MOOCs initiatives are much more closed-mouthed about their work than is usual in higher education, especially about financial arrangements and models. I suppose this must be less of an issue here because in a public university like Penn State, most of this information can be ferreted out with freedom of information requests. But the Canadian and US pioneering of MOOCs definitely caught other universities on the back foot. Earlier this year, the Auditor General of France issued a scathing report about the failure of CNED, France's huge 70-year-old distance learning institution, to adapt to the online world. And you can get the meaning of these headlines without knowing any French, I think. Because the cost reduction potential of MOOCs is highly appealing to cash-strapped governments, they are badgering their universities to get off the back foot and do something. So at the London conference last month, people are asking the questions, are MOOCs a case of the early bird getting the worm, or might the second mouse get the cheese? Like most analogies, these should not be taken too far, but they indicate the debate. So I start with FutureLearn, which is an ambitious British MOOCs initiative. It is led by the Open University through an independent company and includes, as well as nearly 20 well-known UK universities, important national institutions like the BBC, the British Council, the British Museum and the British Library. And the backgrounds of the 2 key players are interesting. Simon Nelson, the CEO, is from the media industry, where he played a key role in the development of BBC Online, one of the world's most visited and successful websites. Martin Bean, an Australian-American who was the general manager of worldwide education products for Microsoft, before joining the Open University as Vice-Chancellor a few years ago. Nelson nails his colours to the mast with this statement, quote, "The role that entertainment plays in learning is often overlooked. Take a glance at massive open online courses, MOOCs. They are often very conventional, based on lectures broadcast at students rather than engaging with them. The language can be rarefied and niche. Ask most people the meaning of MOOC or pedagogy and they wouldn't have a clue. Perhaps this partly explains the enormous dropout rates and why many of those completing MOOCs are practicing academics who are familiar with the culture and semantics." Put that in your pipe and smoke it. Since I can't tell you much about the platform or the courses of FutureLearn, since these are under development, let me give you a few more quotes from the principals. Here is Nelson again. "Our product will be designed 100% for students. Drawing on 40 years Open University expertise in teaching and learning at a distance, we have an opportunity to do something very different. We have access to vast amounts of data gathered through the Open University's own OpenLearn platform and iTunes U, on which the Open University is the largest player. We'll use this information to engineer in features that will make the experience of studying and staying with FutureLearn highly rewarding and, yes, entertaining." And here is what Martin Bean has to say. "I can sum it up in 3 words: quality, not quantity. FutureLearn may not be the biggest, but I'm determined it will always be the best." And this is where we get to some quite important stuff. Many think that there is only value in formal qualifications and that informal learning is a waste of time. The experience of the OU shows that there is a vast amount of traffic between informal and formal learning tracks. For example, 100,000 OU registered students also study with OpenLearn, which is free and open to all. So at the moment, as you can see, FutureLearn is all about aspirations and planning. Nevertheless, this is a powerful gathering of institutions, and they will certainly bring more diversity to the MOOC space. And I shall be following 2 aspects of FutureLearn particularly closely. First, as I noted earlier with my comment about access to success, I am very uneasy that most MOOC learners, even the few who complete and pass, will have nothing useful to show for it in the way of credit. So I shall be very interested to see what Martin Beans means when he says, "And instead of measuring dropouts, we will be rewarding success. FutureLearn will celebrate everyone's achievements, no matter where or how far their learning journey takes them." And the other aspect that I shall watch is the business model. I think it's true to say that whereas the commercial companies involved in MOOCs do have a business model, even if it involves some wishful thinking, I don't yet see a business proposition for the universities involved other than soft objectives like gaining reputation or following MIT. In this area, the Open University does have a track record because it has already shown that thousands of learners who begin by studying its OpenLearn resources for free convert into fee-paying students. And this is the point in Martin Bean's comment about traffic between formal and informal learning tracks. However, it's less clear how this model will help the other UK universities involved in FutureLearn, which, given their selective admission processes, probably have as many fee-paying students as they want. Not to mention the fact that it is one thing for a Mongolian student who succeeds in a MOOC to take an Open University course for credit while remaining in Ulaanbaatar, but rather another for her to move to full-time study in the UK. And I'll return later to the question of whether one impact of MOOCs will be to increase dramatically the number of regular credit programs offered online. Let me now say a word about India. With its low-cost base and high intellectual potential, India could be a major player in global online learning if it got its act together. Already, teachers in India tutor many American children online, but what about MOOCs? The lead is being taken by the National Programme for Technology Enhanced Learning, NPTEL, and two close-ups of the material on their website screen grab are worth pausing over. First, this initiative involves the most credible institutions in Indian higher education, the IITs, the Indian Institutes of Technology, and the IISCs, the Indian Institutes of Science. And you can see their logos at the top of this slide. Second, this is India, so there is volume. 200 courses already on offer and 1,000 planned. And the model is interesting. The course materials will be accessible free, but there will be a $10 fee for certification. The platform will be Google Course Builder, and the faculty will adapt the extensive pool of open educational resources to construct the courses. NPTEL's OER videos have already attracted some 80 million views. Most interestingly, to my mind, the system will use industry-based managers to act as contacts or mentors and will use an industry-built ID authentication and e-governance platform for proctoring. Certification examinations will take place across the country at weekends and can be taken at any time. They expect between 150,000 and 200,000 requests for certification this year. And the inputs from IT companies to the courses and the certification process are expected to improve the quality of graduates. According to one of the IIT professors leading the project, quote, although there is no written commitment, the understanding is that companies will consider people who fare well in these courses for recruitment. My final example of another MOOC initiative is Open Up Ed, which was announced in April. Led by the European Association of Distance Teaching Universities, Open Up Ed is a partnership of EADTU institution members in 11 countries across Europe. And its fairly embryonic website lists some 60 available courses in 12 languages, including a course in Gaelic offered by the UK Open University. I haven't been able to find out whether a common delivery platform is being used, so I assume that for the time being, each participating institution will use its existing platform. So for the time being, it looks as if Open Up Ed is more in the nature of a one-stop portal for existing courses of consortium members across Europe, many of those members being open universities. And this all brings me back to my earlier cartoon. When a word gains currency, as MOOCs has, everyone wants to apply it to what we are doing. So we are back in a situation where all generalizations are false, including this one. Let me end by evoking briefly some of the points that I made in my musings on MOOCs paper. This paper, as I said, was written when the MOOCs frenzy hit its first peak and was called Making Sense of MOOCs, Musing in a Maze of Myth, Paradox and Possibility. And I list just 4 myths. First, university brand is a surrogate for teaching quality. Clearly it is not. The first wave of universities offering MOOCs gained their reputations in research, and nothing indicates that they have special competence for online teaching. I make an exception for MIT, which has been working this territory for over 10 years, starting with its open courseware project, and doing so with the explicit purpose of improving its on-campus teaching. And after my experience with colleagues here this morning, I'm beginning to think I should accept Penn State from that stricture too. The second myth is that you cannot use the word quality about courses with 95% dropout rates. The quality assurance agencies that now exist in most countries would consider this a disaster. It would perhaps be more honest to stop using the word course about MOOCs and simply call them open educational resources with some self-assessment questions. Third myth, MOOCs are not a new pedagogy. Referring to the early ex-MOOCs last year and not mincing his words, well-known ed-tech blogger Tony Bates commented that, quote, ex-MOOCs were based on a very old and outdated behaviourist pedagogy, relying primarily on an information transmission, computer-marked assignments, and peer assessments. Now, we've already heard from the example I gave from here at Penn State with Anna Da Vinci's course that this is changing, but that was where it started. And myth 4 is simply to suggest that MOOCs are the answer to the expansion of higher education in developing countries. This, in my view, is neo-imperialist hubris. To suggest that MOOCs from other countries are the answer to situations like this stampede for admissions at the University of Johannesburg is to clutch at straws. Turning quickly to paradoxes, the big issue is the double standard about who gets credit. You pass a course on campus and get credit. You pass the same course as a MOOC and you don't. This means that the key to getting a degree is the admission process to the university, not your performance as a student once you get there. The late Dan Caldwell, an American colleague of mine at Athabasca University, used to call this the principle of good little piggies in, make good bacon out. It is a venerable academic tradition, and the institutions I attended were based on it, but I don't think it's fit for the 21st century. Fortunately, more and more people are giving credit for MOOCs, which will shake things up. But I must end on a positive note. Like all frenzies and fads, MOOCs have generated plenty of contradictions and lots of nonsense talk. But the movement they have started can yield big benefits. First, it will make universities think harder about the quality of their teaching as learners start to compare and rank MOOCs. They will no longer take it for granted that a good brand means high-quality teaching. Second, the term open in MOOCs introduces healthy transparency. People worldwide can see whether a course from Harvard or Penn State is actually any good. And third, grappling with MOOCs and the online world generally will stimulate universities to clarify their missions and particularly the role that online learning will play. Finally, and this may be a little scary, the movement may finally cut the outsized costs of higher education, which, as you know, have been growing much faster than inflation for decades, particularly here in the United States. So let me end by flagging two areas of personal involvement in these exciting developments. First, I have just completed contributing to the editing of a guide to quality in online education, copies of which are available to you all here today. The authors are South Africans Neil Butcher and Meredy Strydom Wilson, who have the great merit of having feet in both the developed and developing worlds, which is very important now that online learning is becoming a global phenomenon. Second, many universities will find it useful to have a commercial partner as they move online and try to climb the slope of enlightenment. And I've been impressed by the work of the Academic Partnerships Company, and in particular the values of its president, Randy Best, who to my surprise resonate closely with mine. I never expected to find a banker who believed as much as I do in getting costs down and access and quality up. This is a man who is stretching the iron triangle. The aim of academic partnerships is indeed about access to success, to offer regular credit programs online to large numbers with student success at least as great as on campus, which their track record so far shows. You will know that academic partnerships is helping many state universities with aspects of their online offerings. So I conclude that MOOCs are taking higher education in new directions. Offering MOOCs may not be the most important destination for most institutions, but they are forcing them to decide where they are and where they want to be on the hype cycle of online learning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John, for an enlightening and challenging talk. I would like to let you know we have individuals online with us who are joining us via MediaSite Live. I will monitor questions that come in from that group. But I'd ask and invite the audience to come up, post questions, engage in dialogue. That's the model we want to create here. And to let you know, you need to be at a microphone when you do that because the site and the audio is being recorded. And we'll also have this video available. The recording of this will be available from the MediaSite Live of the libraries and from the COIL website. Also, John referenced the new publication. Those are available for you. We've got about 75 copies, so there's plenty. And if you wish to take some that you might share with your other colleagues, please feel free to do that as well. If you'd like more than what we have, we can arrange to get more as well. So with that, let me open up the floor for discussion, questions, thoughts. And just remember to come up to the mic, if you will, please.
So you talked about the hype cycle, and you used the model of the university or other educational institutions as the consumer of this technology. You know, looking at maybe like, you know, the increased expectations being the benefits to the university. I'm wondering if you think about the hype cycle in terms of the general population, so people that may be taking these MOOCs or employers looking to hire people that have certain credentials. You know, if you go down that thought experiment, you know, does that maybe change expectations or maybe change some prognostications about the future?
Yes, I think it does. In fact, I'm giving a talk at MIT's Link conference next week, and for that I did a slide of the hype cycle a bit as you suggest. I mean, I was making this up sort of from my imagination, but in that, for the ordinary people and for the students in particular, there will be a much lower hump at the beginning, because there was. I mean, we've seen this at different stages of sort of excitement, and then a bit of a dip, but then a very steady rise. You know the figures better than I do, but I think this year at least 30% of all US students are taking some of their courses online. The forecast is that that will be 80% by next year. And by the time you get to 80%, you know, you're reaching most of the student body, and presumably the students coming after that are no less digital than the others. So, you know, I think there was my imagination of that hype cycle would be there was a bit of a sort of peak of inflated expectation. Gee whiz, this is IT, this is wonderful, this is going to be better than old Professor Jones in the lecture theatre. But then a realization that, you know, the world is the world and reality is reality, but it has colossal advantages for convenience and ability to revise and this and that and the other things, selecting your program and so on. And that therefore this is something that more and more students are going to want to get involved in, which is why I think that the goal has to be to use MOOCs, as I think you are doing at Penn State, to get yourself really geared up to be offering online in the majority of your programs. Now, that's, I mean, that's not a difficult challenge. I do think it has colossal down the road implications for usage of physical plant and all this kind of thing. I mean, I'm not really even going to attempt to answer that. But, you know, I do think you've got the human capital here on campus to really make a go of this, which some universities don't, because you are much further through the world campus in having done online and got involved in that, whereas it's my impression that for some of the institutions who followed the flock of sheep into MOOCs, if their students or anyone else say, right, you know, we'd like some more of this, they're going to be a bit flat-footed because they don't have a background in it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yes, thanks.
Do you see a future for open source platforms that would take universities away from having to deal with terms of service and using server space from places like Google Course Builder?
I'm probably not technically competent to answer that, but I would have thought the answer was certainly yes. I mean, I think this stuff is existing more and more just out there, and you can take it. And one of the interesting questions, which I didn't address because obviously couldn't address everything, is the exact relationship between open educational resources, open courseware, and MOOCs. Some people, I mean, when Martin Bean shows his slide of the development of open education, he has MOOCs as one further step in the development of OERs, and that is true in some cases. I mean, MIT certainly, their stuff is open. I understand that they're going to make the edX platform open source. In other cases, it's a lot less obvious, and George Siemens, who you saw on one of these slides, from Athabasca, is making a speech at the International Distance Education Conference in China in October, in which he like rings the alarm that MOOCs are in danger of taking us backwards on the spirit of openness of materials. I think, frankly, if you're teaching a course to 100,000 students, you can forget about trying to keep it secret, because, you know, so that it's part of probably the rather desperate attempt to find some way to monetize this. So, you know, don't let go of the copyright because we just might be able to sell that. So, yeah, I think that the cat is out of the bag so much. The growth in the number of open educational resources, the improvements in the ways of searching for them mean that's just out there. The interesting question, for my mind, is that this is a huge boost to the general unbundling of higher education, which is enabling students to put together courses and study themselves, not just through MOOCs, but by grabbing OERs. But that raises the question, okay, well, that's fine, but I would like someone actually to recognize this for me. And that is happening too. In the MOOCs paper, which is now out of date, I quoted figures which showed that you could get a MOOC, you could get credit given for a MOOC in a way that you could add it to a regular program by applying to the University of Maryland, Maryland College. But by the time you'd gone through all the processes, that would have probably cost you about $1,500. And it would have probably been cheaper to take the course anyway than to do that. So, but, I mean, you know, that was then and this is now. And I think a lot of regular universities, if you like, are under certain conditions offering credit for MOOCs. But there's also a development called the OER University, OER small u, because it's a consortium of some 18 institutions around the world, all credible, mostly public institutions, who have got together to try and help students get mentored and certified if they're studying in an open way through open educational resources, MOOCs and so on. That's still in its kind of embryonic stages, but as always when there's a vacuum, people move to fill it, and I think that students are really determined to do this thing on their own, will be able to find ways of getting it credibly attested to and so on. And had a very interesting conversation over lunch with Cal Peck, who tells me that Penn State is moving into this area of open badges, which is another aspect of this, because actually some people may not particularly want university credit because in the area they're working in, if it's technical, an open badge given by that community of practice may be much more credible and useful than something with a university's name on it. So it's all in a big state of churn, but I do believe it's generally heading in the direction of more openness, despite people's attempts to put a cork in the mouse hole. But,
thank you.
Kyle.
So I'd like to keep you up on that plateau. You talked about the plateau, and you said it was just there and gone. And I know you've been thinking more about this hybrid space where significant use of online learning happens, and then there's the university with face-to-face services and teaching and the unbundling. And what could you sort of share your thinking with what that plateau looks like for higher ed?
Yeah, well, first thing I should say is that I did 17 years as a university president, but I'm rather glad I'm not one now because I think these are very, very challenging times. I mean, if I go to the sort of extreme end of it, I and others tend to use the word hybrid sometimes to be slightly reassuring to people who'd be scared silly by the idea that their students might go entirely online. So hybrid sounds nice because they can still use all these wonderful facilities on campus and so on. But more seriously, I think how patterns of study evolve in future will obviously depend to a large extent on the students. I mean, at the end of the day, they're sovereign. And they will, in many cases, pick it for convenience. There will be some experiences they simply cannot have because of their lifestyles. However, to the extent that the university can control that, it seems to be very important that universities work at making the face-to-face together on campus part of the hybrid extremely worthwhile, because otherwise, and we've seen this. This is not a new phenomenon. We've seen this over a good number of years now. That particularly commuter campuses, the more students can do it at home, the more they can arrange their weekly timetable so that they have time for a bigger job, more work, and so on. But more importantly, it's a sort of what the scientists call a cooperative phenomenon. The fewer students go to campus, the less exciting campus becomes, and it becomes a sort of downward spiral, which is quite dangerous. So I think that universities which genuinely value the campus experience, other than as a nice environment for the sort of faculty to live in, really have to do some hard thinking about how to make that so valuable that students are going to want it and pay high fees for it, even at the same time as they're doing a lot of the work online. But I mean, I'd be interested in your own views on this, because I think it's a future to create. It's not something that's going to just happen.
Well, I do think we're headed there. I think that the hybrid looks something like taking everything that students can learn on their own and with peer support and allowing them to do so for free. But then I see the hybrid as being, there's another stage. So there's that sort of independent online asynchronous aspect. And then I think there's a synchronous aspect where we can do things together where interaction is important, but not necessarily face-to-face. So, through Adobe Connect or Skype or Hangouts or whatever the next technologies are, real-time, synchronous, interactive experience, but not necessarily face-to-face. And I think there will be advantages to face-to-face. And one of the things that I find very interesting is I don't know if you've heard about MOOC Campus.
No.
But there's actually a campus opening up in the Smoky Mountains, I believe it is, where people will come and take MOOCs together. And they'll share dining halls and dorms and things like that. But they'll be taking the classes. It'll be trying to create the rest of what a university is. And it's got a lot of nice entrepreneurial-looking founders and so on. It'll be interesting to see how that goes. But
that is a real phenomenon. I don't know if any of you have ever seen the film Educating Rita, which is there's a bit of poetic license in Rita, but it's about a girl who takes an open university course. And what the really powerful experience at the Open University was to attend one of their residential summer schools, because for some courses students had to come to a campus to do sort of 24/7. It really was pretty well 24/7 academic staff. And the atmosphere in these places was just unbelievable. It was terribly threatening to some marriages, but it was a very good academic experience. So, yeah, people do want to do this. I mean, they want to talk face-to-face. They want to meet the people that they're online with and so on.
And I also would just add to that I think we'll still be selling the great big degrees, but we'll be selling smaller units that people can assemble into resumes that make sense for them, and we'll be allowing people to sort of assemble degrees. Like right now we have, it's not very well publicized, but we have the ability for undergrads to create a bachelor's degree, an interdisciplinary bachelor's degree. And we may find ways of allowing people to create their own combinations that make sense, where we're selling, the interactive parts. And on the unbundling, I like what you're saying about it separates the teaching, and our job is going to become largely credentialing. I mean, assessment and credentialing and creating learning communities where people, find value in the others and the services we can provide, social bookmarking and so on.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and it's a very interesting future. But I think too, the credentialing. What's interesting in your work here is that people will be looking for certificate or for some attestation to their competence in the 21st century skills that everyone talks about. It's actually, I would have thought, quite difficult in normal university structures and credentialing to certify communication skills, empathy, all these good things. But you can do that through badges, as we were talking about at lunch. So for a student to collect a bunch of badges on soft skills and other skills outside the formal curriculum, but very useful for employment, is another avenue that I think we should be exploring pretty hard and not let others corner it.
Thank you. And to my couple of students who are here, thanks. I used some information from your elevator speech on badging. It does work, the elevator speech.
So, John, I was struck by the comment you made about the value of higher education and the reference to the students paying for, what do they pay for? Where's the value placed? And you said it's placed on the price of admission rather than on what the student can do. And MOOCs are kind of challenging that, because now students can show this is what I can do, even though I didn't pay you to admit me. I'm just wondering, for an institution like Penn State, and most other institutions, we control the educational process from stem to stern. Mm-hmm. And this environment now means we lose some of that control, right? We're turning over the decision-making, the sovereignty to the student for selecting where and how and what they use. I'm wondering about the finances. How do we, within these institutions that are based on tuition-driven and research dollars, but tuition to a large part, how do we change our thinking about that financial transaction if students pay $125 for a certificate versus $1,500 for the entire course? How do we begin to change internally? Is it made up in volume? Is that part of the idea, or is there a path that we need to be considering from MOOCs to degrees?
Yeah, well, I think as a former university administrator of many years standing, I would like to think that universities could sort of at least keep up with and try to define that movement. I somewhat suspect that we will have to follow the pressures, the financial pressures, if you like, the popping of the tuition bubble and so on, and adapt as fast as we can. So yes, to be charging for credentialing and making that something that is making that highly credible for your institution, that you really can offer credentialing across a wide range of things, badges, normal certificates, and so on. But I don't think there'll be as much money in what you might call content display and lecturing as there was. So I think it's a big challenge. It'll happen, I think, more slowly than one thinks. And never forget that right now there are some 150 million students worldwide in higher education. The forecast is that by 2025 that will have gone to about 250 million in round figures. So that's around 100 million new students who will be entering higher education over the next 12 years, say. Now, they mostly won't be in the United States, that's for sure. But, I mean, this is not a business that's about to collapse. So, you know, there have to be ways of trying to help that along and pay the bills while doing it. Yeah. But, I mean, put it this way, I'll be extremely surprised if the curve that has put tuition in the US at 30% above inflation over the last, no, it's more than that. Anyway, you know the figures.
Yeah, sure.
But I think those lines are going to come much more closely together, if not cross. So it's hard thinking time, I think. Okay. It really is.
Other questions, Wayne?
So the MOOC movement is primarily a movement that's based around courses and content in courses. And in fact, the coin of the realm in higher education has primarily been about degrees. Students come to earn degrees, not to take courses. It's been interesting to me that I haven't heard a lot of discussion from the higher education community around, well, we're about degrees, not about courses, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, for one thing. But secondly, degrees are supposed to be a whole lot more than a collection of particular skills or even knowledge points. They're supposed to lead to a different thing, and they have a whole greater than the sum of their parts. So do you think MOOCs have the potential to drive degrees out? And if not, what will degrees become? Can they withstand this sort of challenge?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things in those statements that I'd challenge. I mean, in a way, as I said, I don't really think MOOCs are courses. They're interesting display of content with some self-assessment questions, but they're not a course in the sense that the university offering them will give you credit for them if you pass it. So fine. But I'm not saying they're a bad thing, but they're not that. And, I mean, it's for sure that the university is offering them. I mean, this thing's only been going, you know, in the US for barely 12 months. So when people jumped in, oh my God, Harvard's done this and the university in the next state is offering a MOOC, we've got to do one too. The challenge was to get a MOOC up and running, not to get a whole degree program up and running. Because when you do that, then you face the challenge of assessment and support and so on. I mean, what I've been trying to point out is that people just assume that if there are 4 noughts on the end of your number of enrollments, you know, if you're sort of 10,000 and above, then it's impossible to assess and mentor those students properly. Well, that is nonsense. The open universities around the world have figures well over 100,000 students enrolled, and they are doing a perfectly good job of mentoring them, certifying them, giving them degrees which are recognized in most cases by the society around them. So, you know, it's one. That's why I think you should see MOOCs as a route to the regular online learning. So, you know, it's the challenge for World Campus to get on this thing and tame it and make it work for you. And I better be very careful here, but I think there's a lot of flannel talked about the whole being greater than the sum of the parts. For a very small minority of students, that is probably true. The football team, the sex, the whole lot. I mean, you know, this is all fine. But for most students these days, the whole is the sum of the parts. The whole is what they get out of it. And, I mean, I'm not trying to say that each course is a self-contained thing. After a certain number of courses, you master an area. But the kind of rather rosy-eyed talk about the wonderful experience of having been a student or whatever, I think is just not reality for most students. So I wouldn't base too much of the future on that. If you make each of the individual parts of very high quality, chances are the whole will be of high quality too. And you shouldn't hope that a loose connection of dodgy sort of things will make some wonderful whole that people will say, oh, that was brilliant. Sorry, but
Interesting. We could debate this for a long time.
yeah, no, we can. Yeah, we can.
John, I'd like to begin by trying to separate online learning as we practice it every day and as it's being used by institutions all over the world with MOOCs.
Yeah.
And posit that just as that kind of online learning has helped institutions of all sorts adjust themselves to the needs of students and society in the information world, that the next generation of MOOCs, once you get past that chasm of disillusion you talked about, that third generation of MOOCs may help us reinvent extension, may help us reinvent non-credit continuing education. A lot of the language I heard used today sounded very familiar. Mm-hmm. Non-credit continuing education over the years has been used to help people gain information that they can apply in their jobs. They get continuing education credits that they can sometimes use to apply towards college credit. They can take credit by exams after some of those. It's very similar. And yet that kind of continuing education has been on the downturn in recent years. So I'm wondering whether MOOCs, that third generation of MOOCs, might in fact be ways of creating communities of interest around extension-type topics, research and technology transfer, agricultural improvement as one example, global change or climate change is another example, a way of bringing people together around ideas and around the practical application of those ideas, rather than as simply another way to think about the traditional curriculum.
Yeah, no, but Gary, I'm sure that's already happening massively. The only problem is you can't follow it as you used to be able to through continuing education systems. I mean, you know, one of the quotes I gave, and it's well known. One of the reasons we know that the first enrollments in these MOOC courses were so high was that there were a bunch of tourists who were faculty from other institutions checking out what all the fuss was about so that they could see whether they should go down that route. So as that sort of tails off a bit, the thing will stabilize more, and as there are more MOOCs, obviously, they'll tend to be, on average, fewer in each one. But yes, certainly for me now, if I were interested in some non-credit continuing ed, I'd probably go and deal with it through a MOOC. Whether I joined a community of practice or not would be another question. But I would personally not want to paint them into just that corner. I think they have a role in putting what you call, I think, traditional online learning on a much greater growth curve, because we should all be grateful to MOOCs for having given online the sort of punch of media, fashion and respectability that it didn't have before. And I mean, you know, I'm a boring old veteran of many years, but this was exactly what happened when the Open University was created. Suddenly, the second-rate correspondence education industry advertised on the inside of match packets and so on was given a new pizzazz by having broadcast programs on the BBC that everyone was watching at peak time and learning about physics and so on. I mean, that's all changed, but nevertheless, it gave a whole new fillip to that thing and began to make it respectable. So we should rejoice, and I think it can lead us in different directions which aren't contradictory in my view.
Yeah, absolutely. My intent wasn't to restrict MOOCs to non-credit kind of activity or extension kind of activity, but to bring that in as a kind of natural way of using the MOOC environment.
Because I mean, you and I
to better engage the university with the community.
You and I both worked in the wilderness for many years when people thought we were sort of really a bit beyond the pale, and should this university even be dabbling in this stuff, you know? So we should always be glad when suddenly one is sought after, because this is the way of the future. And I mean, you know, the university presidents suddenly, I mean, they're falling over themselves to know what they should do about online learning. Offer a conference for university presidents on online, and you're subscribed within 24 hours. It's good. Good, thank you. Anyone else? Yes, gentlemen.
May I say welcome to Happy Valley if no one said it yet?
I thought
It
that
was-
was a race course in Hong Kong.
Oh, no, 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 no. And by the way, the dean's office has an absolutely fantastic view of Mount Nittany. If no one's shown you yet, make him do so.
Deans usually treat themselves to nice offices.
Better than the president's, honest to goodness, guaranteed. I thank you so much for mentioning the matchbooks. As a young man, I was an avid matchbook collector. They do not exist anymore, so I have a very rare collection. But very often, I thought and I paused when I would find a matchbook that talked about a class you could take, correspondence course, you name it, it was on everything. I think there's a big difference, though, when you're talking about the MOOCs and universities, because I think there's a confusion between the ivory tower and the bureaucracy that supports it. Ivory towers are not bad things.
No.
They're an opportunity for individuals to immerse themselves and be around people that allow them to extend their own thoughts and to bounce things off. When I look at the computer operations that are going on, the technology that we have, it's reminding me a lot of the old 50s and 60s where when you didn't have a job, you were sitting there and you were watching television, and all of a sudden an educational program came on. They are not effective at teaching, in my opinion. I have materials here at this library, I work here, that are of lectures of some of the finest teachers in the country that anyone can come in and check out if they want to. But who checks them out? The faculty members, because they want to hear how the best is projecting to their audience. I don't think any of the people who are currently doing anything online even have a clue at how to really get to their audience. How are they projecting that? And that's why I say I understand the interest, the jump to technology, but the opportunity to be in the same room, the opportunity to have a dialogue back and forth, the opportunity to hear something that just pops out of someone's mind that may have the experience of not just their own research, but also their opportunity to have dialogue with their compatriots within the same faculty. I just don't think that can be reproduced for the masses. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, I think we have a wonderful university system, but unless you've gone to Harvard or Stanford or, a lot of the top-tier schools, most really good, well-paying positions are not necessarily going to be in your reach. I mean, there's a snobbery there. And unfortunately, that's never going to stop with the general public. But there are some fine people coming out of community colleges. But I think even they are better than what's online because you have people who are there interested in teaching, people who are interested in spending a block of their history being involved in education. So I thank you so much. I think your research is phenomenal, and I appreciate it greatly. And I'm going to steal one of those before I leave.
Take on.
But the idea that we can replace a place like Penn State or a place like Bloomsburg College or a place like Harvard, I just don't think it's feasible. And we don't want to give people an opportunity to feel as if they're not learning. I want to give them the feeling that they're actually accomplishing something for their thirst for education. Their profession could be something completely different, but their thirst for education, I don't think is going to be satisfied by technology. I'm sorry, I took too long.
No, I'd agree with a good part of that. I mean, I certainly agree with a bit about the importance of ivory towers and places where the intellectual people can come together and have discourse and so on. But that makes it even more important that institutions like Penn State ride with the waves so that they retain the possibility to be that. And what I'm trying to say is that as the whole approach to teaching changes, Penn State should be following that so that it's still a vibrant institution and is not leaving it all to the University of Phoenix to do the teaching. I mean, a few years ago, I was giving a talk in which I posed the challenge that we were going to bifurcate the university system into public universities doing research and for-profit universities doing all the teaching. Now, you know, I exaggerated that to make the point, but I think that there looked like being a real danger, and I think there still could be a real danger. Fortunately, some of the for-profits screwed up by some dodgy practices, but I think that threat is still there. But I do think, I agree that university is not for everybody, but I think it is actually extremely healthy in a democratic society that as many people as possible should have the opportunity to, I would put it, see the university at work. I mean, again, early days of the Open University, Harold Wilson, the Prime Minister of Britain, whose idea it was, spent a lot of time in Chicago watching what was going on with radio courses and so on there. And he insisted that the Open University have a large presence on BBC television because he wanted to open a window so that people, the general public, could look in to see what universities did. He wasn't expecting most of them to enroll as students, but to see physics professors, people talking about sociology in prime time, in an academic discourse that was approachable and accessible, he thought was a good thing, and so I think did many members of the British public. We've lost that to a significant extent with the fragmentation of the media and so on, that people only watch what they think they want to watch, so whether it's political or whatever. But nevertheless, I think my general point remains. But I think in this world it's always dangerous to say this thing is so precious it can't possibly replace, because that may be telling you that it'll be replaced much sooner than you think. If I could just say a word about this. This is Open Educational Resource. It's a guide to quality in online learning, structured in the form of 16 frequently asked questions. It then has an annotated reading list with about sort of 20 or so key, no more than that, 30 key publications and quite a long bibliography. One of its virtues is that because it's written by two South Africans, they have a foot in both the developed and the developing world, which is quite important now. Online is becoming a global thing. But also they really do give examples from all over the world, which for a rather insular country like the US is actually quite healthy to see that actually there are people in Australia and Hong Kong and other places doing interesting things. So I think we've probably, no, there's someone coming from the back. And I didn't write this thing, by the way. I just helped to edit it and get it in simple language that I could understand.
Thank you very much for your talk and for coming here today. I was curious whether you think the popularity of MOOCs in this country will cause mainstream institutions of higher education here to reconsider some scalability barriers that I think the OU got passed a long time ago with some of its models, but have never been accepted by mainstream faculty here, and that where like the Open University uses a system of tutors to be able to scale courses. So the research faculty have a sort of a creation role, but then there's a system of tutors that helps to scale those courses in ways that still provide students with rich learning experiences. And we haven't had very wide acceptance of that kind of model here. And I'm wondering if you think that MOOCs will cause any reconsideration of that.
I'm sure it will in some cases. I mean, that to me is the fundamental question. I think I had a slide saying something like universities that had scarcity at the center of their business model had suddenly embraced openness. I mean, let's take it away from making snark comments about the United States. I went to the University of Oxford at a time when not more than 6% of the British population of the age group went to university. So just getting into Oxford, I mean, you were made, really. I mean, getting out of Oxford with a degree wasn't all that difficult once you got in. Getting a good degree was a bit more difficult, but getting out with a degree, in fact, it's probably impossible not to get out with a degree once you'd got in. So defining reputation by the selectivity of your input has long been what the brand means. And to the general public, it it's hard to get into, therefore it must be high quality. So I think the universities having experience of MOOCs are going to have to individually think through that. And some may decide that they're going to treat it as a separate add-on, which is just a way of giving their profs exposure, and it was a nice thing when it happened and so on. But others, and I would hope that Penn State would be among them, say, wait a minute, we can scale this thing up and still retain our reputation for quality. And the selectivity thing is not then a question of we must be good because we refused 9 of the 10 students who applied, but our selectivity is seriously done so that we think that a student who we select to come to the university has a reasonable chance, if they work decently hard, at coming out with a degree. Because what you don't want to go is to go the other extreme and sort of have the Phoenix problem. You admit sort of anything that moves, and then you suddenly have a big problem with student loans. Now, but if you do that, you have to tool yourself up in different ways. The Open University was open because it abolished all admission requirements except to be 18 years old and first resident in the UK and then in the European Union. But it did a lot of pre-counselling to people. When they saw that someone had only finished primary school, they would call them up and say, you do realise, don't you, that there's a university course and so on, and you might want to think of getting a bit more education before you start with us. But if the adults said, I've heard all that, I want to have a shot, then fine. And during the first year, they got much more mentoring and tutoring than they did in the subsequent years. And the data, I mean, I'm a bit out of date on the data, but it showed that, yes, in the first year, students with poor educational backgrounds did significantly less well than students who had reasonable backgrounds. Second year, that gap had almost disappeared. By the third year, it disappeared completely. So, they proved that it was possible for a motivated adult to repair a damaged educational background and do good things. So, I mean, I think you've put your finger on what is the fundamental question I want to leave with you. Are these a nice sideline, but we'll go on doing what we do? Or can we actually offer our excellent product to larger numbers of people successfully so that they complete and get qualifications and support Penn State as alumni, and you can continue putting up expensive buildings every year for the foreseeable future?
All right, with that, we'll wrap up, and please join me in thanking Sir John Daniel for an enlightening, engaging talk. Thank you.